Listen, I am Mama Otomba, and I still remember the first night I heard the city breathe like something alive beneath the cobblestones of Harlem, when the jazz was not just music, but a language the dead still understood and spoke through brass and bone and broken memories. And I tell you this not as a woman who dreams too much, but as one who has buried too many truths to pretend the night is ever empty. I came to Harlem in the late 50s, when the clubs were still glowing with cigarette smoke thick enough to hide sins, and the saxophones cried like wounded spirits calling names nobody dared to answer. And I carried with me the old cloth bundle my grandmother gave me in the desert lands beyond the Niger, where the sand itself is said to remember footsteps of those who angered the unseen world. She told me, Mama Otomba, do not fear the city where iron sings, but fear the silence between its songs, because that is where the ancestors slip through when they are looking for unfinished stories. And I thought she meant grief, but I learned she meant something far more dangerous. I found work cleaning tables in a nightclub called the Blue Crescent, a place where white men came slumming for jazz, and black men played like their souls were for rent. And every night I noticed her before anyone else did, the woman in white, who sat in the last row, always alone, always still, never ordering, never speaking, only watching, as if the music itself owed her an apology. At first I thought she was just another lonely soul drawn to the music like moths to fire, but then I noticed no one ever acknowledged her, not even the bartenders who counted every glass and every sin in that place. And when I asked about her, they looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language that tasted of iron and warning. One of the musicians, a trumpet man named Caleb, who had fingers like trembling prayers, told me not to look at her too long, because people who did sometimes forgot their own names before dawn. But I'm not a woman easily frightened by warnings wrapped in superstition, because I was raised where spirits do not hide behind metaphor, but sit beside you at the fire if they choose. So I watched her night after night, and I began to notice the air around her did not move the same way, as if sound itself hesitated before reaching her, and the jazz that filled the room would soften whenever her pale figure leaned forward, as though even the instruments bowed in reluctant recognition. On the 7th night, I brought her a glass of water she never asked for, and when I placed it on her table, her fingers did not move, but the glass still trembled, as if something beneath the surface had touched it first. And she looked at me then with eyes that were not entirely anchored in this world, eyes like pale mirrors reflecting a sky I had never seen. And she whispered something I did not understand, but felt in my bones like a memory that was not mine. That night after closing, when the last trumpet note faded into the alleyways and the club became a hollow shell of spilled liquor and tired laughter, I heard my grandmother's drum in my mind. The one, she said, could call ancestors or warn them away depending on how it was struck. And I knew then that the woman in white was not a patron but a crossing point, a place where something ancient had learned to sit in human shape. I began to bring offerings without telling anyone, small things like salt and crushed cola nut hidden in my apron pocket, leaving them under the last chair where she always sat, and each morning they were gone without trace, not consumed, not taken but erased, as if the world had decided they were never placed there at all. Harlem in those days was already a place of fracture, where hope and hunger walked arm in arm, but beneath it I felt another layer, older than the brick buildings and older than the hatred that clung to certain streets like fog, a layer where something vast and patient was pressing upward, testing the boundaries of what human music could contain. Caleb told me one night that the band had started hearing a second rhythm beneath their own, a slow dragging pulse like footsteps through sand. And I knew without asking that he too had begun to hear her presence, even when he refused to look. And then came the night. The mirror in the ladies' room cracked without being touched, and every shard reflected the woman in white standing behind me, though I knew she had never left the last row. And in that moment I understood that she was not coming closer to us, but that we were all slowly being arranged around her like instruments, waiting for a hand to decide the next note. I remember how the air changed after the mirror broke. Not in a way that shouted or screamed, but like a room slowly learning it had been occupied by something it never agreed to host, and Harlem, even in its loudest nights of jazz and laughter and rage, has always known how to fall into a hush when something older than its history begins to breathe inside it. The club did not close after that night, because men like the owner of the Blue Crescent do not close doors for spirits they cannot invoice, but I noticed the musicians began tuning their instruments twice before every set. as if brass and wood could be persuaded into obedience through repetition, and Caleb would sometimes pause mid-note, his trumpet-lowered eyes fixed on the last row, as though listening to instructions no one else could hear. I did not speak of what I saw growing in the cracks of that place, because in my grandmother's teaching silence is not absence but preparation, and some truths only survive if they are not named too early. The woman in white still came every night, still sat in the last row, still did not move in ways that belonged to flesh fully committed to this world. But now there were changes so subtle they made my stomach tighten like a drum pulled too tight over warning hands. The air around her began to smell faintly of dry earth after rain that never reached the ground, and sometimes when the saxophone cried too hard I would see shadows behind her that were not cast by any lamp in the room, shadows that bent inwards as if listening more carefully than any human ever could. One night, I followed the sound after closing a decision I knew was foolish even as my feet made it for me, because curiosity is a kind of ancestral debt that collects interest in blood. And I found myself standing in the alley behind the Blue Crescent, where the music still lingered like smoke refusing to forget its shape. There I saw Caleb, though he did not see me at first, playing his trumpet into the brick wall, as if the city itself had become his only audience, and behind him, not touching the ground, stood the woman in white, her presence folding the dim light around her like fabric being drawn into unseen hands. I wanted to speak, to call his name, but my voice caught, because I understood then that he was not performing for her, he was answering her note for note, breath for breath, as if she were pulling the sound out of him rather than listening to it. When she finally turned her head toward me, it was not sudden, not dramatic, but like a tide deciding to recognize the shore. And in that slow recognition I felt my grandmother's teaching stir deep in my ribs, because what looked like a woman was only the shape something chose to wear while it studied us. She spoke then, not with lips, but with a pressure inside the mind, a language that did not arrive as words, but as images pressed into feeling, and I understood fragments without translation. Desert wind over boned cities built on buried songs. A hunger that learned patience by watching humans forget their dead. Caleb collapsed to his knees as the final note left his trumpet, though no sound had physically struck him, and when I rushed forward to him, I saw his eyes were open but unfocused, as if part of him had stepped slightly out of alignment with his body. The woman in white did not approach him, but the space between them tightened, as though distance itself had begun to lose authority in her presence, and I felt something in me resist the old training of my grandmother's blood rising like heat under skin. I reached into my apron and pulled out the small pouch of salt and crushed kola nut I had carried for days, not knowing why I still carried it if not for this moment. And I whispered the words she taught me in a tongue that tastes like earth and warning, and when I threw it onto the ground between us, the alley flinched. The sound that followed was not loud but deep, like a string being tightened somewhere beneath the city itself, and for the first time the woman in white reacted as if something had touched her boundary, her head tilting slightly as though considering whether I was an inconvenience or an invitation. Caleb gasped, then air returning to him in a violent rush, and he looked at me as if I had pulled him back from a place he could not yet describe. But behind him the woman's shape began to shift, not disappearing but becoming less anchored, like ink loosening in water that refuses to stay still. I understood then that she was not there only for him, not only for the music, but for something the music was opening, something Harlem itself had been unknowingly rehearsing for decades through every note played in smoke-filled rooms, where pain was turned into art because survival demanded transformation. And as I stood there in that alley with salt burning into the cracks of stone and trumpet echoes still trembling in the air, I realized the last row in the Blue Crescent was not a place in the club at all, but a threshold that had been quietly widening each night, waiting for enough sound, enough grief, enough human breath to make it passable from the other side. What came after that night in the alley is not something I ever learned to speak of lightly, because once you see a threshold, realize it has been opened for a reason. You stop believing that doors are always meant to be closed in Harlem. My Harlem of smoke and trumpet cries and tired laughter began to feel like a city holding its breath too long, waiting for either salvation or collapse, depending on which side of the music finally answered first. The Blue Crescent did not change in obvious ways. No lights flickered out, no walls cracked open. No grand spectacle announced itself. But the woman in white began to arrive earlier each night, and sometimes she was already seated before the first note was played, as if time itself had begun to accommodate her schedule, and the last row no longer felt like distance but like alignment. Caleb stopped speaking between sets, not from fear exactly, but from the exhaustion of carrying conversations he did not remember initiating, and his trumpet began producing tones that made older patrons uncomfortable without knowing why, like hearing something in a familiar language that suddenly stops meaning what it used to. I began to understand what my grandmother meant when she said spirits do not invade places that are empty, but only places that are already singing too loudly to notice what else joins in, and Harlem in those years was a cathedral of sound. Every club a chapel of survival disguised as entertainment. One night the owner tried to dismiss me after I spoke too many warnings, but he could not meet my eyes for long, because by then even skeptics feel when their walls are being measured by something that does not care for permission, and I stayed because I knew leaving would not mean escape, only delay. That night, the woman in white stood for the first time not in sudden motion, but as if the decision had already been made elsewhere, and she was simply catching up to it, and when she rose the room did not react immediately, as though reality itself took a moment to confirm it had witnessed the correct interpretation of what was happening. The jazz band played without stopping, but the music shifted, bending inward no longer for the audience, but toward her, like iron filings drawn to an invisible magnet buried beneath the stage, and I felt my grandmother's name rise in my memory, like a prayer I had not used in years. I stepped forward not because I was brave, but because silence had become more dangerous than speech, and I asked her not with voice alone, but with intention sharpened by old teachings, what she was, and why she had chosen this place of broken songs. The answer came as a flood of sensation rather than words, and I saw desert civilizations built on listening stones. I saw musicians in cities that no longer exist feeding sound into cracks in the earth to keep something beneath it asleep. And I saw Harlem not as a mistake, but as a continuation of that same fragile agreement, where suffering became rhythm and rhythm became containment. She was not a ghost in the way humans name ghosts, nor a demon in the way frightened men name their fears, but something older that learned to wear identity, the way a river wears banks, temporarily obedient, but never truly contained, and she had been drawn here not by one musician, but by the accumulation of all music that had ever been born from pain and refused to die. Caleb stepped forward, then lifting his trumpet, and for the first time I understood the terrifying truth that he had not been resisting her influence, but gradually becoming its instrument, his talent widening like a doorway he did not know he was building. And the last row was no longer where she sat, but where sound itself crossed over into something else. I remembered my grandmother's final warning, that some songs are not meant to be completed, but only interrupted. And I realized Harlem's jazz had become too beautiful, too honest, too full of grief, turned into precision, and that kind of beauty is always noticed by things that feed on resonance. I took the salt from my pocket again, though I knew it was no longer enough, and I spoke the oldest name I had been taught, not of her, but of grounding, of return, of refusal, and the air in the Blue Crescent cracked like glass. Remembering it is fragile. For a moment, everything paused, the trumpet, the breath, even the woman in white, and I saw behind her not a face but a vastness trying to learn how to enter without breaking what it admired. And in that pause, I made a choice that cost me something I will never recover. I turned the music itself away from her, by stepping into it, becoming the interruption my grandmother warned me would one day be required. I sang not beautifully, not like them, but like something older than performance, like dust remembering water, and the club shuddered as if it had been given permission to refuse an invitation it had been unknowingly accepting for years. The woman in white did not vanish, but she receded, not defeated but acknowledged, as if my song had not ended her presence, but relocated her patience, and the last row became empty for the first time in memory, not because she left time. In memory, not because she left, but because the agreement had been rewritten. When dawn came, Harlem looked unchanged to anyone who did not listen closely, but I knew the truth was simpler and heavier. The city would always sing. But now it remembered that not every listener belongs to the same world, and I, Mama Otomba, remain to ensure the boundary between music and hunger does not forget itself again.